Welcome back, everyone. Today we will be reading Chapter 17, so let's get into it. Much of what follows has already been described by Christopher Plover in Fillory and Further, his beloved series of novels for children, and ably enough, too, as far as it goes. I don't take issue with his work. I've made my peace with it. But as you will see, his story was not the whole story. One difference I must insist upon, before and above all else, is that what Plover naively presented as fiction was, apart from some details, entirely true. Fillory was not a figment of our imaginations, or his, or anybody else's. It was another world, and we traveled to and from it, and we spent a good part of our childhoods there. It was very real. Rupert had stopped and traced and retraced these last letters, very real, over and over again, until the paper had begun to shed little shreds of itself, as if it couldn't support the full weight of the meaning he wanted it to carry, the burden he wished to unload onto it and onto Plum. At first, Plum couldn't have put her finger on what exactly it was that was freaking her out about this story. But that was it. She'd expected Rupert's memoir to be a typical upperish crust, jolly hockey sticks account of an English boyhood, enlivened by a behind-the-scenes look at the makings of the Fillory series. But it was dawning on her that Rupert was going to persist with the joke. He was going to stick to his story, and the story was that Fillory was real. Maybe this was the Chatwin legacy, full-on insanity. There was madness in the family. Plum put a finger on the wounded paper and felt its roughness. She wanted to heal it, but she couldn't. She could only keep reading. It is difficult to write those words, knowing that they will not be believed. If I were in your place, I wouldn't believe them. I would stop reading. But they are the truth, and I can't write anything else. I am not a madman, and I am not a liar. I swear it on everything I hold sacred. I suppose I ought to say that it is God's truth, and it is, but perhaps not the God you are thinking of. After Martin and Fiona went into Fillory, through the grandfather clock, I went through with Helen, and that is how all the events described in The Girl Who Told Time came to pass, more or less. A lifetime's worth of adventures, all of which happened in the space of 5 minutes in a dusty back hallway of an old house during the First War. By then, Jane was awake and alert again, so all 5 of us went through together. Already I can see you shaking your head. No, you've got it wrong. They always went by twos. Well, damn you and damn Plover too. We often went together. All of us. Why wouldn't we have? The truth is, there were many adventures we never told Christopher Plover about, and many more that, for his own reasons, he didn't see fit to include in the books. I suppose they must not have fit neatly into the plot. I can't help but feel that I myself was somewhat slighted in Fillory and Further. It's petty of me to say it, but I do say it. I stood vigil at the gates of Whitespire during the long evening. I claimed the Sword of Six, and then broke it on the peak of Mount Merryweather. But you wouldn't know any of that from reading Plover. I was perhaps not a pretty young man. I wasn't as appealing as Martin. I didn't make good material, as they say in the literary business. But I suppose if he didn't write about me at my best, he didn't write about me at my worst either. He never knew the worst. None of them did, except Martin. Regardless, all of our lives split that night. They became double. A more alert guardian than Aunt Maud would have noticed the change, the whispered colloquies, the tanned faces and uncut hair, the extra half-inch or so of height we would gain during an especially long trip to Fillory. But she didn't notice. People are very determined to see only what they can't explain. Anyone who has led a secret life, spies, criminals, fugitives, adulterers, knows that a facade is not an easy thing to maintain, and some people are better at it than others. I, as it turned out, had something of a gift for lying to adults. I sometimes wonder if I was left out of certain expeditions simply because I could be relied on to cover for the others. I don't know how many times I found myself forced to invent stories, outlandish but far more mundane than the reality, to explain why one sibling or another hadn't turned up for mass or lessons or tea. We were always scrambling to change in and out of our Florian things before they could be discovered. Our feats of arms often left us covered with scratches and bruises that had to be accounted for, too. Martin's shin was split wide open once by an arrow, hunting bandits near Corian's land, and he spent a month in Fillory, convalescing. Perhaps the greatest indignity was having to pretend that we didn't know things that we'd learned in Fillory. I still remember falling over laughing, watching Fiona, the great huntress of the Queenswood, laying it on thick at the archery range, getting tangled up and finally sitting down on her bum, trying to string a bendy little schoolgirl's bow. We gave that up in the end. Jane just didn't care enough to dissemble. And one day, she simply galloped away from her riding class, hallooing wildly in centaur as she cleared the stone wall at the end of the meadow and disappeared into the forest. After that, we all stopped caring. Let people be amazed, if they absolutely must. Very often, when the way to Fillory was closed to us, and we had exhausted the limited possibilities of Aunt Maud, her house, her library, her staff, and the grounds, we crossed the road and picked our way through the trees and through a gap in the hedge to Mr. Plover's house. I know now that he cannot have been over 40, but we thought of him as a very old man because his hair was already gray. I think he was quite terrified of us at first. He had no children himself, and was not much used to their company. As children went, we were very childish indeed. At that time in our lives, Martin was the closest thing we had to a parent, and although he did his best, he was still only 12. We were loud and obstreperous, and very nearly feral. Even on the first day we invaded Plover's house, we sensed the conundrum that Americans are faced with in England. They're too frightened of English people to behave rudely to them, and too ignorant to know how to behave politely. We exploited it, unwillingly to throw us out, incapable of entertaining us properly, unable to think of anything else to do. He offered us tea, though it wasn't yet 3 p.m. It was an inauspicious start. We threw our crusts and dueled with our spoons and tittered and whispered and asked rude questions as we ate. But we did eat, for it was a very good tea, with nice biscuits and homemade marmalade. Plover can't have enjoyed himself much, but he was wealthy and unmarried, and had already retired from business. And he must have been nearly as bored in the country as we were, so we all soldiered on. In most respects, the occasion was very unsuccessful, and we couldn't have guessed at the time that it would be the first of many. I realize now that we, all 5 of us, must have been very angry children, angry at the absence of our parents, angry at the presence of Loche, neglectful Aunt Maud, and her many suitors, angry at the war, angry at God, angry at our own strangeness and seeming irrelevance. But people are slow to recognize anger in little children, and children never recognize it in themselves, so it comes out in other ways. Whatever the reason, we competed to see who could push the boundaries of property the furthest. It was Fiona who won that contest, and I recall her doing it triumphantly, with an almost sensual pleasure, by mentioning Fillory. This was a transgression not only of earthly rules, but of Fillorian ones. The disrespect was not toward Mr. Plover, who was merely baffled, but toward Ember and Umber, who had sworn us to secrecy. Up until that moment, none of the 5 of us had ever said the word Fillory within earshot of an adult. We weren't even positively certain that we could. Would the ram's magic reach across the void between worlds and seal our lips? It would not. There was silence at the table. Fiona froze, alive and trembling with delight at her victory, and with terror at her sin. Had she gone too far? Nobody knew. We waited for the thunderclap of retribution. "Fillory?" asked Mr. Plover, innocently, in his flat Chicago tones. He seemed happy to have found a question to ask us. "What on earth is that?" "Oh," Martin said airily, as if the admission cost him nothing. "It's not on Earth at all. It's a place we go to sometimes. We found it inside a clock." And after that, the boundary was breached, and the walls crumbled, and we all rushed ahead, the stories tumbling out one after the other, none of us wanting to be left behind. It really was too funny. Plover listening away, and after a while making notes on some loose paper. He was wide-eyed at the treasure trove of childish whimsy he'd stumbled on. He must have fancied himself a later-day Charles Kingsley, the Charles Dodgson de Nos yours. He would never ask about it right away. Instead, he would work his way around it, circuitously. He would chat and nod and observe the niceties, but always the moment arrived when he would reach for a notebook, which he never seemed to be without, hoist a leg over the other, lean forward and say, in his queer accent, neither American nor English, "And what's the latest from Fillory, huh?" But it made a difference to us, being able to tell someone, anyone, even a no one like Plover. It made Fillory more real to us, and less of a game. Now we at least had an audience. Sometimes we really would make it up, laughing hysterically to think what Sir Hot Spots or the Stump King would have thought of our tales of birds, made out of leaves and giants who ate clouds. What rot! Helen was practically bad at that game. She could only ever think of stories about hedgehogs, sea hedgehogs, were hedgehogs, a hedgehog of fire. Hedgehogs were the sole extravagance of which her imagination was capable. But Plover took it all in, indiscriminately. The only stories he balked at were the ones about the mammoth, Velveteen Cozy Horse, and those were actually true. Eventually, we prevailed on him to write them down, too, if only because we couldn't bear the thought of the poor thing's feelings being hurt. Looking back on it now, I can see more clearly the strain we were under, continually negotiating between two realities, one where we were treated as kings and queens, one where we were invisible, inconvenient children. The shock of those sudden elevations and diminutions would have given anybody fits. Plover has the stories divided up very neatly into 5 different volumes, but the reality wasn't anything like that tidy or simple. Plover conveniently has us going to Fillory only during the summer holes, except the once, in The Girl Who Told Time, but really, we weren't there all year round. It was never our decision, not after that first night. We went whenever it suited Fillory to summon us. We never knew when the door would open, summer or winter, day or night. Sometimes months would pass without a portal opening, and we would start to wonder if it was all over, this grand hallucination, and it was as if one of our senses had gone dead. We would grow increasingly snappish, turning on each other, everybody blaming someone else for having ruined it, for having offended Ember or Umber or broken one of the other of their laws, thereby queering the deal for the rest of us. Sometimes, during these long lulls, I would start to suspect the others of sneaking off to Fillory behind my back without telling me. I imagined them freezing me out of the game. And then, with no warning, it would all start again as if it had never stopped. On some otherwise nondescript afternoon, devoid of hope or interest of any kind, Fiona or Helen would come rushing into the nursery, wearing a formal gown we'd never seen before, color in her cheeks, hair in outlandish court braids, shouting, "Guess where I've been?" And we would know it wasn't over after all. It was feast or famine. One year, I think it must have been 1918, it seemed as if we spent half the summer in Fillory. It even became unnerving. You'd go to the closet for a clean shirt, and you'd find yourself staring through it at one of those beautiful lumpy Fillorian meadows, or one of its curving shell beaches, or into the still heart of a forest at night. To my knowledge, none of us ever refused. I don't know if we even could have. Once or twice it was a genuine nuance. You'd be about to go into town with Nanny. You'd have been given a shilling for sweets, and the groom had promised you a turn with a good gray mare after, and you'd bend down to look under the bed for your other boot, and before you knew it, you were picking yourself up off the floor of Castle Whitespire, and by the time you got back, 3 weeks later for you, 5 minutes later for everyone else, you'd have lost the money and forgotten what you'd been doing in the first place, and everyone would be cross with you for keeping them waiting. That summer, it was as if Fillory was hungry for us, reaching out and grabbing us greedily whenever it could. It was an insatiable lover. I remember riding into town on our bicycles and seeing a little whirlwind of leaves wandering in our direction. All Martin had time to say was, "Bloody!" before it was on him. It whirled him away, and Helen too, off to the other side. That was the adventure of the Hog Night, which I don't know whether Plover records it or not. I've forgotten now. It all runs together, and here in Africa I haven't got the books with me. I do remember that the bicycles never came back. Even Aunt Maud was cross about that. In some ways, Fillory drew us together, but in many ways, too, it pushed us apart. We got into terrible disagreements over silly things. Fiona told us once that Umber had taken her on a special trip, just for her, to the far side of the world. He showed her a wonderful garden where all the thoughts and feelings that had ever been thought and felt existed in the form of plants, blooming and green as they passed through people's minds and lived in their hearts, and then drying up and turning brown and crisp as they passed out of mind, sometimes to bloom again in another season, sometimes gone forever. It was a lovely story, and it must have been true. Fiona couldn't have made it up. She didn't have that sort of imagination, but it left a sour taste in my mouth. Why her and not us? And not me? Privately, we argued about Ember and Umber, if we believed in them, and we certainly did. Then, was it not blasphemous to go to church in the real world and mouth prayers to God, who had, after all, never showed us a secret magic garden, or a castle all our own, or even to so much as a single Pegasus? Or did each world have its own god or gods, and one should simply worship the god of whatever world one happened to be in? Or were all the gods one god, really, different aspects of each other? Nonsense, Jane said. She'd never heard such rot. We had furious, hissing quarrels about this, and in the end we splintered into the Ramsians. as we called those who worshipped only the rams, Ember and Umber, namely Martin and Helen and Jane, and the more pragmatic anyoneists, namely myself and Fiona, who prayed to the twin rams in Fillory and God in the real world. After that, Helen was always finding reasons not to go to church. Jane, who had the zeal of the martyr, would go on purpose and cause the most awful scenes with her laughing and have to be removed. Martin was simply staunch and grim wherever we were. Of us all, I think he may have loved Fillory the most, but it was a fierce, angry, watchful love, forever alert to the possibility of betrayal. I don't mean to defend Martin, but I do think I understand him. When our parents left, it was Martin, more than anyone else, who filled the void in our lives. He was the one who picked us up when we fell and sang us lullabies at night. But who filled the void for Martin? It can only have been Fillory, and she was a fickle, capricious parent. One thing we did not argue about was why, among all the children in the world, we had been given the gift of Fillory. Why us and no others? Why did Ember and Umber, of all the rest of the Fillorians, show us such special favor, when in our own world we were just ordinary people? I believe that I alone among us 5 was troubled by this, to the extent that I, at the age of 10, had a soul. The question gnawed at it. A mistake had been made, I was sure, a real blunder, because I knew that I was not strong or clever or even particularly good. I knew I didn't deserve Fillory. And when the truth finally came out and the hoax collapsed, the punishment would be terrible indeed, and our suffering would be hot and sharp, in proportion to the blessings that had been showered on us. I didn't even notice about Martin until he told me. We were at school, St. Austell's in Fowey, and he took me with him on a long, freezing tramp around Upper Meadow, a frosted, rotted rugby pitch, where one went to exchange confidences and discuss matters of consequence. I was grateful to be asked. Martin was my senior by 2 years, and older boys didn't generally acknowledge younger siblings at St. Austell's. We were halfway around the track before he spoke. "Do you know, Roops," he said, "it's been 3 months since I last went over." We called it that, going over. He didn't have to say where. He spoke with an elaborate casualness that I'd learned to recognize as a warning sign from him. "As long as that?" "Yes, as long as that. It was you and Fiona in August, then Helen and Fiona, then Jane and Fiona, then Helen and bloody you again 2 weeks ago. Where does that leave me?" "On Earth, I suppose." I hadn't meant to be smart. "That's right. On bloody Earth. I'm bloody well stuck here. Do you know, I've taken to cramming myself into cupboards and closets, and I don't know what else just on the off chance I'll find a way through. Whenever I see a squirrel, I take off running after it in case it might be a magic one on its way to Fillory. The other boys think I'm mad, but I don't care. I'd do anything to get out of here." "Come on, Mart," I said. "You know how these things are. It'll come around to you again." "Did the Rams say anything about me? I'm out of favor, aren't I?" "Honestly, they haven't. Half the time I can't understand what they mean anyway, but I'm sure they haven't said anything about you. I would have told you." "But you'll ask them, won't you, when you see them?" "Of course I will, Mart. Of course I will. I have to do something." He kicked at a heavy black lump like a shrunken head that might once have been a cricket ball. "But look," I said, "I know how you feel. I hate it when I'm not asked, but it's not as bad here as all that, is it? I mean, Fillory isn't everything." "But it is." He stopped walking and looked at me in the eye. It is everything. What else is there? This? Earth? He picked up the dead cricket ball and threw it as hard as he could. Listen, will you come and get me? He grabbed my arm. He was pleading with me. You know, sometimes it comes on slowly. Like that time it was you and Jane. And it was just patterns in the wallpaper at first, you said. Took you 10 minutes to go all the way through. You could come get me when it starts. We'll go together, like back in the old days. I'll try, Mart. I really will. But we both knew that wasn't how it worked. Ember and Umber decided who came, and that was that. You were the first one in. You started it all. You found the way. We both know you'll go again. It's only a question of when. You're the High King. I'm the High King, he repeated unhappily. At the time, I believed it mostly. I was 10, and he was 12, but the gap between us had always seemed wider. I looked up to Martin. I literally couldn't imagine myself having something he did not, doing something he could not. But by the next summer, it was clear that something had changed between Martin and Fillory. The romance was over. In all that school year, he'd only gone over once. And then the Rams let him stay only 2 mingy, grudgingly uneventful days. He spent those days sulking, ruining them out of spite, even though he knew they would likely be his last. He barely left the palace library. The Rams shunned his company. He was on the way out, and we all knew it. It wouldn't have been so bad except that, out of all of us, it was Martin who needed Fillory the most. Honestly, by that time, I think Fiona could have taken or left it. She was already growing out of Fillory. For Jane, who was 5 when it began, it was just normal. She couldn't imagine life without it. It was barely even special. If the Rams had turned Helen out, she would have accepted it. No questions asked. Thy will be done. She would have taken a perverse pleasure in her martyrdom. As for me, I never believed it would last anyway. Every day, every second, I expected it to end. On some level, I would have been relieved. Maybe it was just that Martin was older, that he had lived longer without Fillory. He remembered what life was like without it, and he understood better than the rest of us did how strange and precious it was. The rest of us made friends outside the family, in the real world, but increasingly, Martin did not. He shirked his lessons and filled his exercise books with winged bears. They'd been seen circling over the hen's teeth, and Fillorian coats of arms. A natural athlete who barely had to try at games, he stopped trying at all. He scorned everything in this world, heaped contempt on it. He even ate less and less, as if a bite of shepherd's pie would trap him down here in the darkness, like Persephone. He lived for Fillory. But Fillory didn't live for him. In my later life, I have known alcoholics, more than a few, and I recognized in their faces some of what I saw in Martin's. Loyal prophets of an indifferent God. Martin might have fallen out of favor with Fillory, but never with Plover. Whatever happened at Whitespire, at Dara's house, he was always the favorite. If anything, Plover's affection for him seemed to grow in inverse proportion to that of the Rams. Or maybe it was the other way around. Whatever the reason, Martin was the only one of us whom Mr. Plover ever invited to visit him alone. What they discussed in their private lunches and teas, Martin never told me. But as far as I can tell, those occasions didn't give him any special pleasure. He often returned from them in a brown study, and sometimes he made excuses to avoid them altogether. Now, of course, as a grown man with some knowledge of the world, I cannot help but wonder whether Plover's interest in my brother was entirely appropriate. Such speculation is inevitable, but as both parties are dead, or as good as, I suppose we should be charitable. and assume that Plover merely took a fatherly interest in this bright, sensitive, fatherless boy, a mentor's interest. And yet, Martin and I only ever spoke about it once, and the memory is not a pleasant one. I asked him what they talked about, the two of them, on his visits, and he snapped at me. If Plover ever asks you to come by yourself, don't go. Never go to that house alone. He made me promise, and I did, though Plover never did ask. At the time, I thought it was his pride. I thought he was jealously protecting his status as the favorite, but now I think it is possible that he was trying to warn me, even protect me. I wish I knew. I haven't seen my brother in 25 years, but I sometimes think, when I am brooding on the past, that must have been part of Martin's need for Fillory, his addiction to it. He went there to escape from our saintly benefactor, Christopher Plover, and to find better, wiser, or at least safer mentors in the form of the Rams. And if that is the case, I cannot help but wonder, too, if, in a terrible irony, that was precisely why the Rams stopped bringing Martin to Fillory. Martin was fleeing from Plover, but Fillory didn't want him anymore, because Plover had sullied him. At the time, these worries and doubts didn't trouble me, or not much, not enough. In the years since then, the shadows have grown deep and long, but at the time the sun of Fillory was at its zenith, and I was a child, and any shadows were barely visible. That summer, the topic of Martin's mysterious exile was much whispered about in the relative privacy of our large, crumbling bedrooms at Dockery, especially when he wasn't there. What was the cause, and what could be done about it? We'd all tried to raise the matter with the Rams, but with no success. This is not his time, they would say. When he comes, he will come, and so forth. There was a great deal of that kind of talk, and what a lot of trash it all was. Pious Helen thought it was a shame, but it was the Rams' will, and we had no business questioning their wisdom. Jane sided with Helen, something I believe she came to regret when she was older. Fiona didn't like to take sides against Ember and Umber, but she thought that if we formally petitioned them as a group, they might agree to bring Martin back, or at least tell us what his offense had been and give him a chance to atone for it. We had all done a great deal of service for the Rams, fought on their behalf, risked our lives for them. They owed us that much. To Martin, we made a great show of sympathetic concern, and we were sympathetic, and we were concerned. But some of the concern was for ourselves, too. Martin was getting older. He was on the cusp of puberty, which was something we knew very little about. But we knew that adulthood followed hard on its heels, and we had never heard of any adults making the journey from our world to Fillory. We understood instinctively that Fillory was a world that ran on innocence, demanded it as an engine demands fuel, and Martin was running out. Sooner or later we would all run out. Adulthood would come for Helen next, and then me. Like all children, we were selfish little creatures. I hope that this will in some way explain, if not excuse, what we did next. Martin did what he did, but we helped him. We wanted him to do it, because we were afraid. We made a pact. The next time any of us were summoned, we would do what we could to hold the doorway open, and we would try to get Martin through. We would jam the door, take control of the bridge that connected Earth and Fillory, and force Martin across it. Probably it wouldn't work, but who could say till we tried? It was counter to the spirit of the enchantment. But you could never tell with enchantments. Sometimes the spirit was what mattered, but sometimes they were just letters on a page, words in the air, and it was only a question, as Humpty Dumpty said, of which is to be master. That's it for this week. We will see you guys next week with Chapter 18.